For most of human history, death wasn't something you could look away from. There was no hospital to take the body, no funeral home to handle the details, no polite distance between you and the person you loved most in the world going cold beside you. If someone died, you dealt with it right there with your hands. And the strange thing is, the deeper archaeologists dig into how ancient humans actually handled death, the less it looks like the simple dig a hole and say goodbye story we all assume. Some of what they buried, how they buried it, and who they buried next to who honestly reads more like a mystery novel than a history lesson. So let's get into what ancient humans really did when someone died, starting with a story that upended everything we thought we knew about Neanderthals, and then completely upended it again. Back in the 1950s and 60s, an archaeologist named Ralph Solecki was digging through Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq when he found something that changed how the entire world saw Neanderthals. Buried in the cave was a Neanderthal skeleton, and in the soil around the body, Solecki found clumps of ancient pollen. His conclusion was almost poetic. This Neanderthal had been laid to rest on a bed of wildflowers. For decades, this became one of the most famous images in anthropology. The flower burial was proof that Neanderthals weren't the dumb, brutish cavemen pop culture had painted them as. They grieved. They honored their dead with beauty. They were, in some small way, just like us. Textbooks ran with it. Documentaries dramatized it. It became one of those facts everyone just knew. Except recently, scientists went back and looked closer, and the flower burial might not have happened at all. Researchers studying the pollen found that the way it was clumped together didn't actually match how flowers would naturally fall apart and scatter in a grave. Instead, the pattern matched something much less romantic: solitary bees. Certain wild bees collect pollen in dense little clumps to store in burrows, and cave sediment is exactly the kind of place they'd nest. So the flowers that supposedly proved Neanderthal grief may have just been ancient bee nests that happened to end up in the same dirt. Here's the twist though, and this is the part almost nobody talks about. Even if the flowers were never there, the burial itself is still incredibly strange and important, just for a completely different reason. When researchers went back to Shanidar decades later, they found that this Neanderthal wasn't buried alone. His skeleton was part of a tightly packed cluster of bodies, all placed deliberately in the same small area of the cave, over what may have been generations. That's not an accident. That's not bodies just left where they died. Neanderthals may not have carried flowers to their dead, but they were choosing to return to the exact same spot over and over to lay their people to rest together. In some ways, that's an even more human detail than the flowers ever were. And here's where things get even weirder, because for a long time, scientists drew a hard line between us, Homo sapiens, and the more primitive species that came before or alongside us. We were the ones with religion, with symbolic thinking, with the ability to look at death and turn it into ritual. But a cave in Israel called Tinshemet is quietly demolishing that idea. Inside, archaeologists found burials containing not just early humans, but Neanderthals too, sometimes practically side by side. And scattered around these bodies were things that had absolutely no practical survival use. Chunks of red ochre, a reddish mineral pigment, polished stones, objects that couldn't be eaten, couldn't be used as tools, couldn't keep anyone warm. The only reason to bury something like that with a body is symbolic. It means something. And the fact that this symbolic behavior shows up around both human and Neanderthal remains at the same site suggests that the ability to mourn, to ritualize death, to believe a body deserved more than just being left in the open, might not be a modern human invention at all. It might be older than our species itself. Now here's where the story shifts from the cave to something a lot closer to home, literally. Roughly 9,000 years ago, in the ancient city of Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, people did something that would horrify most of us today. They buried their dead directly underneath their houses. Not in a separate cemetery outside the village, not in some sacred field away from daily life. Underneath the floor they walked on every single day. Bodies were curled into a fetal position and placed in shallow pits, and then the floor was sealed right back up over them, and life just continued on top. You'd wake up, cook a meal, raise your children, all while your ancestors were resting silently beneath your feet. To us, that sounds unsettling. To them, it may have meant the opposite of what we assume. The home wasn't a place you left the dead behind from. The home was where the dead belonged, where they stayed close, where the boundary between the living and the ones who came before them was thin enough to walk across every day. But Jericho didn't stop at burying bodies under the floor. They did something with the skulls that is honestly one of the strangest and most fascinating things in all of prehistoric archaeology. In certain cases, after burial, the skull would later be dug back up and the jawbone would be removed. Then, using plaster, the people of Jericho would rebuild a face directly onto the skull. Shells were pressed into the eye sockets to mimic eyes. Paint was used to recreate hair, eyebrows, even moustaches. What came out the other end wasn't a skeleton anymore. It was a face. A specific, individual, recognizable face modeled from the literal skull of someone who used to be alive. These plastered skulls are considered by some historians to be among the earliest portraits ever created by human hands, thousands of years before painting or sculpture, as we normally think of it. And these weren't hidden away or feared. They were kept in the home, displayed, likely honored, possibly treated as a way for a person's presence to continue on even after their body was gone. Imagine growing up with your great-grandmother's actual reconstructed face sitting in your living room, watching over the household. Here's the part that should really mess with your head, though. Archaeologists still don't fully understand who got chosen for this. You'd assume it was reserved for important people, chiefs, elders, people of high status. But when researchers studied the plastered skulls that have been found, there was no clear pattern. Men, women, even children were selected, seemingly without any consistent rule connecting them. Nobody knows what actually made someone worthy of having their skull dug up, rebuilt and kept as a lasting presence in the community, while someone else was simply left in the ground and forgotten. It's one of those unsolved mysteries that professional archaeologists, people who study this for a living, will straight up tell you they cannot explain. Death rituals weren't only about what happened the day someone died either. In some ancient cultures, death was something you kept coming back to, sometimes literally reopening the grave. In an 11th century cemetery in Poland, archaeologists uncovered a burial that had clearly been dug up and reopened, not by grave robbers, but generations later by the very descendants of the person buried there. Instead of stealing valuables, they added cremated remains directly on top of the older burial. This wasn't robbery. This looks like a returning ritual, a way of layering generations of the same family or community into a single, ongoing sacred space, treating a grave less like a one-time event and more like an evolving relationship with the dead that continued for decades, maybe longer. And in Sudan, archaeologists uncovered something even stranger. A grave containing a ceramic pot filled with charred plant material, animal bones, and insect remains, all interpreted as leftovers from what looks like an actual funeral feast, eaten by mourners and then deliberately buried alongside the deceased. The researchers who found it were blunt about how unusual it is. They said outright that they don't know of a similar case anywhere else, and they still don't fully understand what the ritual meant. Was it food for the journey to whatever came after death? Between the living they'd lost, a way of physically burying grief itself, sealing it into the ground along with the person. Nobody knows for certain, and that unanswered question is exactly what makes it fascinating. Then there's the burials that survived almost perfectly intact, which is incredibly rare in archaeology because most ancient tombs were looted long before modern researchers ever got the chance to study them. In Sicily, a burial complex called the Necropolis of Pantalica sat essentially untouched for thousands of years. Inside, archaeologists found painted ceramics, bronze ornaments, and weapons, all still arranged the way they were originally placed, giving researchers an almost unheard of direct window into exactly how a tomb was meant to look on the day it was sealed, without centuries of robbers rearranging or stripping it bare. It's the difference between reading a crime scene report and actually walking into the room untouched. Even the direction a body faced seems to have mattered deeply. In an ancient South American burial dating back to around 1800 BCE, archaeologists found multiple individuals deliberately positioned so their faces pointed toward the Andes Mountains. That's not a random detail. Bodies don't accidentally end up facing the same direction across multiple burials. Someone made a decision that the mountains, something massive, permanent, and probably sacred to that culture, were the last thing these people should be oriented toward for eternity, connecting the dead to something greater than the grave itself. And status apparently followed people into death in some pretty elaborate ways. In Bronze Age England, archaeologists uncovered the burial of a man believed to have been a powerful communal leader, buried alongside 4 full cowhide rugs, an extravagant display of wealth and importance for the time. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions. About 200 meters away, archaeologists found a second burial, an older man in his 50s or 60s, buried separately, but positioned facing directly toward the chieftain. Some researchers believe this second man may have been a shaman or spiritual figure connected to the leader. Even in death, this powerful man wasn't left alone. Someone else was placed nearby, angled toward him, as if the two graves were designed to remain in conversation with each other across a stretch of earth for the rest of time. When you put all of this together, the flower burial that might have been bees, the humans and Neanderthals sharing symbolic burial customs, bodies kept literally under people's feet, skulls rebuilt into lasting faces with no clear rule for who deserved it, graves reopened generations later, funeral feasts buried in pots, tombs left untouched for millennia, bodies angled towards sacred mountains, and leaders buried facing their spiritual companions across a field, it becomes pretty clear that death for ancient humans was never simple, and it was never final in the way we might assume. It wasn't something to be hidden away, sealed off, and forgotten. It was woven directly into daily life, into the home, into the family, into the landscape itself. And honestly, the more archaeologists dig, the more it seems like they still don't fully understand it either. Which might be the most unsettling part of all. We're still trying to figure out how our own ancestors made peace with the one thing every single human being eventually has to face.